Have you ever frozen in the key moment of making a critical decision? Whether it's in business or in life, it can cost you everything. Commander's Intent will teach and inspire you how to lead with clarity, courage, and purpose. So here's your host, retired Air Force Colonel, fighter pilot, and your leadership mentor, Derek Oaks.
Good day and welcome to another episode of Commander's Intent. I'm Derek Oaks, your host, and I'm here with my co-host Rob and Mike Benitez, the CEO of Purple Rhombus. And we're going to talk to him about the first 6 weeks in his company, what it's been like, how he ended up where he is, what his background is a little bit, and where he wants to take the company, what his vision is going forward. And I want to kind of pick his brain on the decisions he's making and his team and how he's demonstrating trust for them and giving them trust so that he can get the most out of them. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike, and just kind of tell me about Purple Rhombus, how you ended up becoming the CEO, and a little bit about the company.
Okay, I'll start off with an alibi. I don't have all the answers, and if anyone says they do, they're lying to you. So I'll just share my perspectives, take it or leave it. So Purple Rhombus is a venture-backed startup that is founded and formed on the first principles of affordable mass. And that means it has to be affordable and it has to be at scale. That's the mass, right? So the thing that really the company is founded on is a thing called DFM, Design for Manufacture. So everything, we're focused on Group 2, Group 3 drones. So if I build a drone, and there's drones everywhere today, you could throw a rock and hit a drone company. Most of those are made to show something off, right? You see them on LinkedIn videos, YouTube. They're styrofoam, they're plastic, 3D printed. Some of them are composites. They look cool, right? And that's good for prototyping, experimentation, learning, hobbyists. If you're going to build 1 million of them, none of those processes are going to work, right? So design for manufacture is a principles in engineering where you're going to prototype as if you were going to go straight into mass production. And so everything that you do, you approach it from how can I build that faster, better, and cheaper? It's not just about, hey, that curve will look really cool in this video and I can shoot it from this angle and it'll really good video, but we can win a prototype competition, the drone industry. And really, I guess it's a little bit of a vignette of most of traditional Department of Defense. It's a car show. It's a concept car competition, right? People submit paper airplanes? I say kind of flippantly, but I mean, you win billion-dollar contracts on pieces of paper and what you write. And you can dream up of a concept of an airplane and win $1 billion contract in the Pentagon. Like, that's insane for anyone in the commercial industry. That used to be like the status quo for a generation, the 80s and 90s and up until just maybe 5 years ago. That was kind of how it worked. And so you get what you incentivize. And so industry kind of calcified around that. They have concepts and prototypes, and they do that to get feedback and get buy-in to shape how they're actually going to build something. But with drones, like if you build for scale and someone wants to buy it, they should be able to buy it. It sounds pretty simple, but in execution, it's much harder because you could build a drone and you go, here's my drone. Do you guys want it? They're like, yes, I do want it. Like, okay, well, I got to go build a factory. It's going to take me at least 2 to 3 years. And then you can get in the backlog, the firing order, and then maybe you'll have a 4, 5, 6 month lead time and I can get you the first 1 or 2. Like, man, the war is going to be over by then. Come on, man. And the reason why I mentioned all this, I'm kind of going off a tangent up front, affordable mass, and we'll talk about mass later if you want, but it sounds obvious, but you can't deter without credibility. So you have to have a credible means to deter. You can't deter with paper airplanes and proposals. You have to deter with a force that has the capability, the capacity, the readiness, the willing and able to do that thing, which causes that deterrence, right? That's deterrence theory. It's going to be so painful to do something that you have to change how you're thinking about the situation to deter and dissuade someone from acting in a way that would be detrimental. So anyways, that's how I got started. That's what Purple Rhombus is. I got started originally on the software side. I did 25 years active duty, went to a venture-backed software company. And a part of that was putting software in other people's unmanned systems. And so I got to look over about 4 years, I got to look at the entire industry from the Group 1 quadcopters up to the Group 5 collaborative combat aircraft. And you can kind of see, again, how the industry is incentivized and calcified. And I've seen, I don't know, I can't even count, 50, 100 different drone companies at this point. I came across a friend of mine, well, a guy who I knew, worked together in the Pentagon way back in the day, probably about 10, 12 years ago. I noticed that he had changed jobs. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Saw him on LinkedIn. Said, hey, let's catch up. It's been like 4 months or so since I talked to you. He's like, yeah, sure. And he's like, hey, I got working at a drone company. I'm like, well, this is great. Like, and so we got on a call and he starts talking to me about this drone company that he just started out a couple months back. And I'm like, say no more. He got 3 minutes into the pitch. And I said, you can just stop. I totally get what you're doing. Totally understand it. If I was going to do it from like build a drone company from zero, that's exactly how I would do it. And that company was Purple Rhombus. And so that's how, interestingly, got connected to the co-founders. And I knew another co-founder from about a year and a half ago. I met him. And it was kind of funny. We all have this interesting backstory that we all were connected, not in a previous life, but in previous intersections in our, professional journeys. And they were looking for someone to come over and take the team and, lead them to the promised land. And I was looking for something fresh and some new challenges. And, it was the push pull that I needed.
That's fantastic. It makes me think of your comment about having it ready to go. I think of the T7 and
oh man,
what a disaster that is. They roll out with all this fanfare and everybody gets so excited. I love it. I love the stadium seating and looks like a fighter and on and on and on. And it's only single engines. So it'll cost us less to operate. And we can get it to in 4 years. And here we are 7 years later, just getting the first couple aircraft. They're way behind schedule. It's killed us in T-38 maintenance. It's killed us in, what Boeing has charged us for development costs on an aircraft that should have been ready to go. And even if there are other aircraft that weren't as good, they were ready to go.
Chasing perfection is the enemy of good enough. There's probably 5 really, really solid jet trainers on the market today that are not Chinese. And instead of like, just pick one of them and replace the 1950s T-38 fleet, just start replacing them, right? And then we can figure it out later. They want the golden plated solution. And I'll tell you one story about the T7, the new ejection seat. This is a few years ago when they were trying to expand the number of people who had the opportunity to fly ejection seat aircraft. So the ACES 5, ACES 6, whatever the newest seat is that's in the T7, it had a requirement to have a very, very, very low weight and a very, very, very high weight envelope, like a really, really big ejection seat envelope. And the thought was that was going to open the amount of people who, whether it's a small young lady or a really big, football player in the academy team, but it gave them the opportunity to go through on that career path. No one gets stuck in like a mobility fleet or something with that an ejection seat. And so that good intentions, right? But turns out it is wickedly hard engineering problem to have one seat to operate in all of those regimes. So think of not just high, fast, low and slow, but low and slow with lightweight, low and slow with big weight, and all those corner cases that you have to solve for. And so the program actually got delayed a long time because of the ejection seat. So not a Boeing thing, it was an ejection seat thing. But the amount of senior leaders to include 4 stars that had to lean in. And finally, the resolution was, okay, so, this person who's at these edge cases and the seat that we're trying to qualify, let's say we fixed the seat, we spent $1 bajillion, another 2 years fixing the seat. They get to the T7, they crush the T7. When they graduate, what aircraft are they going to go to? And they're like, yeah, there is no ejection seat in any operational aircraft that they could fit in. And they're like, okay, let's just move on with this program and we'll fix the seat as we go. It would take that kind of... Yeah, it's that kind of common sense. You're like, oh yeah, I guess that does make a lot of sense. We just wasted the amount of just thousands and thousands of hours, and really not just hours, but time. That T-38 is going to linger on.
It's just too.
Just lost track of the, what are we doing here, guys? First principles problem solving. We're trying to get the seat expanded to get the trainers so they can get into the fleet. If there's no fleet seat, then what are we doing, right?
That's a great example. Another example that's similar to that is the F-35 HUD. F-35 no HUD, or the helmet. Some of my friends that were flying that at first, They said it was up to 5 degrees off. I'm like, well, how do I shoot a gun 5 degrees off? How do I shoot an ILS 5 degrees off? So what value is that helmet when I had you probably flew a Chehemix, or, at least the pilot flew a Chehemix, and in the A-10, we had the Scorpion helmet, and that thing literally, it was interchangeable with my wingman. I'd strap it onto my helmet with 2 clips, plug it in, bore sighted on my HUD, and it was done. And it was good enough where I could visual ID aircraft from a long ways away, because it just got me looking in the right direction. I couldn't shoot the gun with it, but I didn't need to because I had heads-up display. So for a requirement that did not change the combat capability of the aircraft, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars. And now we have a helmet that's $500,000.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of lessons learned in the F-35 program for sure. The gun is a good one. You're an A-10 guy, so what's the mil dispersion of an A-10 gun of a GAU
5 mils of 80% of the bullets, and 13 mils for 100% of the bullets.
There you go. Yeah. So when the Strike Eagle, I forgot what it was. I'm getting old. 6 or 8 mils. It was something they just do it in total. But it's like the gun, and the gun has to be bore sighted to the HUD. And there's all these systems. So when you point the jet at the right thing, and each jet's bent a little bit differently, and so you make sure you bore sight the guns to each one, right? Well, if you have no HUD to bore sight it to, like what are you bore sighting it? So you bore sight it to the center line of the aircraft. And I can't speak intelligently about how an F-35 gun is or is not bore sighted. But the mil dispersion of the gun system by itself had a very, very, very low mil dispersion requirement because there wasn't a whole lot of bullets. And so when you only have, 140 bullets or whatever's in the gun these days, but you have no heads up display or a way to bore sight the gun to the helmet. It's just, we lost the narrative here, right?
Yeah. What's the point of the gun? That's what they need to do is step back and say, why do I even have this on the aircraft?
Yeah. Well, that's a whole conversation about pulling guns out of fighters. That's a Vietnam PTSD right there.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think like in the space that you're in now, though, when you're talking unmanned vehicles, I just had something interesting on the space with unmanned vehicles. And that's because I work with SOF all the time. And so I watched the way the Air Force ran them, and I watched the way the Army ran them. And they were very, very, very different. I watched this come to pass. The Air Force, if they're up in a valley with some low clouds and an unmanned aircraft smacks in the side of them, it's, oh my gosh, snap, everybody, safety, safety, safety. And they went back and, hey, we got to go back and look at the tapes. And the Army's going, hey, you need to launch us another one. Air Force goes, no, it's too dangerous. Can't do it. The Army doesn't look at them like airplanes. They look at them like Jeeps. When the Army UAV smacks in the side of a mountain, the commander turns to the guy, let's launch the next one. And they launch the next one up and they keep doing it. And so to me, it's interesting because you're talking about affordable means. You're talking about principle that really matches more to the Army's way of doing business. The Air Force has gotten so, tied into this idea of anything that flies is flown by a pilot. Anything flown by a pilot, we have to do these safety measures and whatever else. For the Army and the Marines, everybody else like, whatever, launch this chopper, it's a tool. If it gets shut down, if it gets landings, who cares? We'll figure it out in the aftermath. And so to me, I think it's interesting because it's exactly what you guys are talking about. Because to me, the Army approaches it through the lens of, hey, what are we trying to do here? We're flying an aircraft, so we have to fly it this particular way. So I think it would almost, in some ways, we almost need to have some Army leadership step into the Air Force and talk about how to use things that don't have a person in the cockpit. And if you slam on the side of a mountain, who cares?
Yeah, the times are changing. I'll share a little bit about that. When you're talking about the... Oh man, I had a flashback. I went through weapons school at Nellis in the 17th Weapons Squadron. That's the Strike Eagle division. And I was in class 12 Bravo. So the latter part of 2012, we're in like the last couple weeks. It's all the graduation exercises, all these complicated things. They have all these aircraft out there. And we're in one of the night balls. And all the aircraft are up, all the blues in the east, all the reds in the west. And it was an interesting scenario, but the scenario was we were going to basically send an MQ-9 alone or not afraid across the war and then use them as kind of like the canary in the coal mine to kick off the war. And they were going to go do a maneuver or something and do something interesting. But so we're all in the hold. It's at night. And we hear this. Something on the radio got clipped and it was like lost link. And then it was something and I can't remember what it was. And it's at night and we're turning hot in the cap and, we got MVGs on and we just see this huge flash and this MQ-9 crashes in the middle of the Nellis range at night. And there's probably like 60 aircraft airborne, all just sitting there going like, well, does anyone know what to do right now? And like, no one knew what to do. And like, I've never had an unmanned thing crash in the middle of an LFE. Okay. So, but the LFE hadn't started. So everyone's still in the hold. They're like, I guess we'll sit here. And no one went all the way back to the White Force and the White Cell. And they had to call the wing commander at night. And like, no one actually like, I don't know what to do. We've never actually lost an MQ-9 in one of these things before. And it was just, the times have changed, but back then it was pretty funny. We wasted all of our gas in the hold, came back and landed and had to go refly the mission the next day. But, now, I'd say now is a little bit different. There's different groups of drones, group 1 through 5. One small little quadcopters that you see. 5 is like your, Andrew's Fury, that kind of thing. When you get into group 2 and 3, that's really where some of the interesting stuff starts to come in with that mentality. Back this summer, back in July of 2025, the Secretary of Defense put out a memo, all these acquisition reforms. One of the things that was in one of those memos was really, really, really important. And it was a really, really good signal. And most people missed it. And it was this. It was Group 2, which are under 55-pound drones, are now categorized as ammunition. Like they are throwaway ammunition. And that changes culture and how you're going to use these things. Hey, I don't have to sustain them. They're literally ammunition, right? Like we're going to buy them, we're going to use them, we're going to buy more, we're going to use them. And they're thinking that as an extension of how a soldier would operate on the Group 2 side. So huge, huge, huge change culturally. The Air Force generally doesn't live in the Group 2 or Group 3 space, ground launch stuff, but they're getting into it too. I can't share too much about it, but they are. The Group 3 gets really interesting, back to your point, Rob. So Group 3 starts to fall under a different part of the FAA regulations, and it has all of the same airworthiness stuff of like an MQ-9, which is like insane. So if it weighs 56 pounds, it now has to be treated like an MQ-9. If it's 55 pounds, you're good to go. You can go kind of do whatever you want with it. And that's an FAA thing. So, and it kind of falls into the National Airspace System, which is how the military integrates and all that stuff too. So they're kind of related. But when you get into the Group 3 space, especially something that gets above the coordination altitude, when you actually have to like fly around big aircraft, there are certain nuances that start to come into play. Like, when the three of us used to fly all the time, you would get a radio call, you would change your altimeter settings and, this and that would ensure you're in the right, your altitude is the right altitude. Well, some of these drones, they can't change their altimeter, number one. Number two, their altimeter has, a plus or minus 1,000-foot variance because it's not aircraft certified. So you have so many of these like nuanced deconfliction problems. Like, how do I deconflict something that has, what if I have 10 of them all flying together? Even that, if I have a swarm or a team of 10 drones, just because the INUs and altimeters the tolerances are so high, you actually have to account for all of this deconfliction of the worst case scenarios so they don't run into each other, right? So you have like time, space, deconfliction. So it becomes really, really interesting of how do you actually bring affordable mass and integrate it and use it and apply it on the battlefield. It gets a lot more nuanced than you think.
That's interesting. I did not know that. I missed, because I've been reading all the executive orders that have come out, and I paid attention quite a bit to them, especially the ones that had to do with acquisition reform, and then the ones from Secretary Hegseth about the use cases, but I missed that one. But that's pretty fascinating because it takes in a lot of use cases, and it means, to your point, I don't have to sustain it. And that changes how well it's made. It changes what kind of materials I use. It changes the security levels that I'm going to embed in that thing, the type of equipment I'm going to embed in that thing. So that makes a pretty big difference.
Yeah. And you start competing against, at real scale, these Group 2 drones, you start competing with volume and massive fires like guided artillery, right? Or extended range like Gimlers, rockets. So that's the kind of volume we're looking at. So, I'm so glad that happened. It's going to take time for it to get implemented in a way that people actually do accept that risk and go, I'm going to shoot it. I'm going to go crash it into something. I want to have another one. I'll pull it out of the armory, right? Now they have to have a way to have some kind of working capital fund where they can continue to pull and use those, right? So there's that they have to figure out still. But, culture takes time.
Well, but if you treat it just like ammunition, you treat it like buying lots of 30 millimeter or buying missiles, we've got problems with those in terms of multi-year buys and how we manage our munitions overall, but at least it gives you a little bit of a path forward.
Oh, yeah. When I worked in the Pentagon back when 2015, 2018 timeframe, plus or minus, we were using up all of our good munitions in the Middle East, the preferred munitions. And everyone's like, well, where's all the munitions? Like, well, they're called bill payers. Like no one wants to fund stockpiles. They want to fund the stuff that they can see on the flight lines, all right? So spare parts and munitions are the two bill payers every single budget cycle. That's just how the Pentagon works, because no one can see. You rob Peter to pay Paul, but no one's going to see that manifest on your watch. All they're going to see is the good things. And so it's, if you went and looked at really looked at the budget books and, the dirty secrets, and we can talk Air Force stuff if you want. That's leadership and courage to go, hey, I'm actually going to fund my weapons system sustainment accounts at 100%. The last time I think and someone's going to correct me here on the show, maybe General Deptulo, he probably has the right number, but the last time a U.S. Air Force operational platform, F-16 or whatever, was actually funded at 100% weapon system sustainment is probably 40 years ago. So they're all funded at like 60 to 80%. And then we put money in the flying hour program. And so you have this disconnect of like, well, the flying hours I can't execute because I don't have spare parts to fix the jets, which is why my readiness is low. And so it's a multifaceted problem that takes, part of it is just explaining it. It's people who don't live through it and understand all the nuances. It's hard to understand, but once you understand it, it's like, oh yeah, if I don't have parts, I can't fly the jets. So I don't care about what the flying hour program is.
And this, to that point, because of how we buy things, now I'm going to get off on another tangent, because of how we buy things and because of how we color money, we get to the end of the year and we start wasting money on things that, yes, we kind of need, but not really. And yes, you can buy spare parts, and yes, you can buy consumables with those ops and maintenance money, but you can't buy everything. You're not going to buy munitions with that. You're not going to buy you're not going to go into contractual obligations with that kind of money because it's the wrong color money. And so you're limited definitely in what you can do. When I was on the air staff, I remember they were trying to push us to shut down the white phosphorus, Willie Pete production. Like, well, you can do that, but it's a bad idea. And this is why it's a bad idea. Thankfully, but it wasn't just Willie Pete, it was just rocket production for the Air Force. And luckily, the Army helped us keep that going. And then we get to, the APKWS where, hey, we can actually, for this Buck 25 rocket, put a cheap seeker on it. And it acts as good as an AIM-9X. It acts as good as a lot of things. And it acts as good as a GB-54 for some targets. But it took some thinking to get us to that point, definitely. So let's go back to the Purple Rhombus. That was a great discussion. Let's go back to Purple Rhombus. So what is your goal right now? Like, what is your target audience? I'm guessing you're exclusively selling to military right now, but I don't want to assume that's correct. And, what is your growth, your desired growth, and your...
Oh, pulling me right back on track, aren't you? Well, yeah. So to answer your first questions first, the defense is U.S. defense is what we're focused on. I respect what the international community has to do, especially in the coming months and coming years, Europe, Pacific. As a company, I'm not focused on that right now. There's plenty of other people to meet that demand. I'm focused on helping the U.S. right now. So that's first thing. Purely defense. We're not trying to brand anything we're doing as dual use. What we're doing is we're saying that if you want affordable mass and you want it today using the industrial base that you have, then we're your people. And I say that because if you look at World War I, World War II, where you have to actually mobilize the industrial base to do something, you don't go to war with the industrial base you want. You go to war with the industrial base you have, and you just figure it out, right? So like World War II, it took, the U.S. started mobilizing the industrial base before we ever got involved in the war, like 2.5 years before. And it still took us about 2 years into the war for all that stuff to finally, start making dividends, right? Start making a dent in things. And, we're not going to have that kind of time. You can look at and you guys are probably seeing all of the war games and simulations, and there's some really good public ones now, but even like 10 years ago when we were all looking at it, like 45 days, like no conflict is going to last. It's going to end, and it ends in like 3 different ways. None of them are good. So when you go in 45 days, if the fight's going to be over, what's the point of awarding contracts when someone has to go, pour a foundation and build a factory? Like that's just not going to work, right? And so what we saw an opportunity between, to be fair, we do need to build a better industrial base. We do need to make the investments in the factories. All of those things have to happen. But it's not an either or, it's a yes. And so we have actually looked at the industrial base that exists, and using the process and our approach that we're using, there is capacity everywhere to build drones at a way that's radically affordable at radical scale. And that's really what I've been passionate about now. There is a way. This is not a physics problem. It's not a technological problem. It's just a pragmatic execution problem. And those are the easy problems to have.
Well, I was going to say about that, it brings up some stuff. One of the classes that I had at SAS, we did this whole thing on the confluence of technology, culture, operations, all of these things. And so that brings to mind to me, if you're talking about using our current industrial base to be able to build these, UAVs at scale, the next piece, though, goes back to the previous discussion we had is, okay, at least maybe it sounds like some of the culture is changing to what we need it to change to help us to get to the employment. But now I'll go the next one forward. And this is a discussion that I had for at least a year sitting in the Air Force Research Institute about who employs those UAVs. And the Air Force was so stuck on this whole pilot thing. And what you're talking about is giving enough iron in the biosphere. You can't produce operators at the same scale that it sounds like you are looking to be able to produce I know. So do you, in your vision board, do you put any green lights into working with the Air Force on how to solve that problem? Or do you just say, hey, I'm going to give you the hardware and you figure that stuff out?
Oh, what a great question. That's one of the first, I spent, as I've been on board about 6, 7, maybe a little bit more weeks now. And I spent the first 30 days, with the team and just looking, asking questions. And I'm a big fan of there's two types of people you kind of run across in defense circles. You run across the ones that have strongly held, loosely informed opinions, and they stand out pretty well. And they don't typically age well. And you're like, God, you don't know what you're talking about. And then you have the people that are opposite. They're actually going to be quiet. They're going to have strongly informed, loosely held opinions. And they're always looking to grab more evidence to shape and continually evolve the way they think about something. And so that's the kind of person I am. I like to ask a lot of questions. I like to sit and kind of think about stuff. And then I usually ask questions to kind of get me on a path or get someone else on a path to pull more information out of them to help, contribute to that body of knowledge. So one of the things I did is kind of set the team down and was like, okay, I see what you guys are doing. I came on board not as a co-founder. So we have the co-founders and a small engineering team. I said, totally get it. That's why I'm here. But now we got to think about the whole thing, right? And so instead of trying to explain .mil PFP to them, I said, hey, there's 4 buckets we're going to break this whole thing down to. And this is kind of drilled into my team is FADE, fabrication, assembly, deployment. And so if you have 1 million drones, there's one thing is you can fabricate all the pieces. Then you have I got to put them together, right? That's the assembly. Now I've got 1 million drones I've built and assembled in the United States. How do I get them to where they need to go? So think about like the logistics. Okay, now they're there. I've got 1 million drones sitting on the ground at base X. How affordable mass doesn't matter if it's not in the air and doing something. Like it's just stuff on the ground and storage, right? So you have to have a way to employ the mass, right? And some of it's through like, how do I automate the launching process? Once I get, 10 at a time, I can't have 10 humans controlling 10 things. So you have to have that mission autonomy, that outer loop kind of control software to break the one to end. And so I can have one human controlling 10 or 20 things. And that was, when I came from that software world where we were driving down that path really hard. So that world is coming and it's coming fast. And I'd say that, 4 years ago, that was kind of like, we'll see. And now there's at least a half dozen companies that can do that pretty well, just in the United States. So that's going to be a big part of it. And then I think the other part of it, you kind of alluded to it, but just to like be crystal clear, a couple of weeks ago, I was actually out in the field at Fort Benning with the Rangers, and there's NCOs doing this stuff, right? So as we work with Air Force Special Operations, I think there's a real opportunity to create some alignment between how the non-conventional forces are thinking about this. And I think that is probably going to plant the seeds to, Big Blue eventually.
That's good news. You're right. I mean, when we were using the MQ-1s, MQ-9s, the Air Force was so averse to letting anybody but a pilot touch that aircraft. And in some ways, it made sense. It makes sense in FAA-controlled airspace. It made sense when you're talking about large force employment because you need somebody who understands three-dimensional maneuvering and all of that. But simply operating a little, especially a one-way drone, why am I going to waste my time in training on something like that?
I'll pull a thread on that real quick. The Global Hawk, I mean, it's the biggest, most expensive drone in the entire arsenal, right? I mean, it's huge. It's like, $140 million or something like that. But when Northrop had designed it, they had designed it to be like push a button. I mean, there's no joystick or anything. It's not like flying an aircraft like an MQ-9 GCS is. It's a flat panel with like buttons, right? And so if you understand the procedures and you push the right buttons, like you don't have to be a pilot. So like there was that pilot program, no pun intended, to have enlisted pilots operate the Global Hawk because it's like you just push the buttons. It's pre-programmed, for better or for worse. And that I think that's closed down too just recently. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that lost a lot of steam as leadership changed out. But again, culture takes time, right?
It's a risk aversion thing. Well, if I'm buying that bomb, I'm going to be responsible for that bomb. And I think we all have seen that too much in the Air Force and our risk aversion from acquisition to employment and maintenance and all of the above. There's a level of risk aversion that I can't have a bad event on my watch. So I'm going to control it a little bit more.
Constraints breeds creativity. I mean, I'm sitting here as like living proof. I am a weapons systems officer that flew in the backseat of the F-15E Strike Eagle. Do you guys know why the Air Force has weapons systems officers?
I'd like to hear your take on it.
So, well, there's the old days, like World War I type stuff, where spotters and things like that. But the modern history is that the Air Force had F4s, and there's 2-seat F4s, and there used to be where a pilot flew in the front and a pilot flew in the back. In the Vietnam War, they actually didn't have enough pilots. And so they started looking at different ways to bring in operators from other career fields that were in other aircraft that were navigators and teach them some radar skills to sit in the back of the F4. So when you look at like some of the air-to-air kills in Vietnam, if you actually look at the board, like there's a lot of Air Force F4s where 2 pilots were flying that day that got those kills. And just as many, there was a pilot and a Wizzo, because they were experimenting with bringing other people besides pilots because they didn't have enough pilots. So the constraint of manpower is what started that creative process of what else can we do? And so I always find it's interesting, like if you can artificially constrain something in an environment to get those the license to be creative and try new things, powerful things happen.
That brings me back to one of the points you made earlier, because you talked a little bit about the war game stuff. That's a little near and dear to my heart for a couple of reasons. Number one was I worked at the end of my career, I was in J37, sensitive activities. I was the chief of sensitive activities for J37. And as part of that, I ended up getting roped into some future war games. So we were war gaming some future conflicts against America's enemies in the 2030 to 2035 time range. And so we're looking 15 to 20 years in the future is what we're trying to look at. And so I was very excited about this, thought, hey, this is going to be great. And so I go over to the Navy's, these war gaming gurus are running these war games. And we've got the CIA team that's playing the red cell. And we've got, all the team from the Pentagon that's come over there to represent our forces. And I was absolutely flabbergasted when I realized that we're doing these war games on hex grid paper and dice rolls. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I get it. We're trying to just try out some concepts here. And I'm a geek, so I can say this. I played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, and that's the way we played Dungeons and Dragons. That's great. I really didn't expect at the very top end of the Department of Defense to be running its war games in such a fashion, because I think we weren't able to really learn the lessons that we need to. And it gets to your point of being able to push the envelope and constrain things, because I will guarantee you, if we had the right software, and this is kind of, again, it's right near and dear to my heart. This is a project I've been working on as a hobbyist for the last 5 years. But if we had a piece of software that could help teach not just our young airmen to think about air power and how to use it in the battle space, but also other services. I know how difficult it was, because you've hit on 3 things here. One is being creative and inventive. 2 is this idea that we can't do anything new. And then the last piece is, well, I just do what I've seen because I don't have any other way to test it out. Okay, then why don't we create that environment that allows us to have, I would love to take, a game environment and turn your affordable mass UAVs into it and see what it looks like. Because I don't think we have an idea. And that's the next piece in your E, right? Your employment is, okay, well, what's the TTPs going to look like? What's our doctrine going to look like when we're playing with this affordable mass? That changes the battle space. And if you continue to think about it from a traditional, chaotic perspective, if you continue to look at it like, well, this is, airspace, and this is how we dole it out, we will not operate that at peak efficiency.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot, I didn't give away too much, but there's a lot that you can do with things like this that are well beyond just take off, go fly one way and hit something. At some point, you have to honor the threat, right? Which is going to create some kind of decision commitment calculus, right? So there's a lot of second and even third order effects that you can generate with this kind of capability. And so it's not just small, cheap drones that are going to go on a one-way mission. There's a lot more. It's a really powerful tool, and there's a lot you can do with it.
Well, one of the historical analogies that I think of is they went back to the Manchester campaign in World War II. And Germans had ships coming down from Greece and coming down to resupply what was going on with Rommel and his forces. And over time, the Army Air Corps would devote some bombing missions to go over and try to strafe or bomb some of the ships, the cargo ships, that are trying to do some interdiction on that battle space. Some of the generals were trying to look at it later and say, well, how effective was that? Because we didn't score very many hits. We didn't sink any ships, and we didn't score very many hits. But the second and third order effects, where you say you have to respect the threat. Well, those ship captains sure as heck respected the threat. They didn't want to have anything. So they changed their entire routing to go out of the way so that they would not be in, the threat envelope of the Air Force, the Army Air Corps. And because of that, they weren't able to get the supplies there as fast as they had before. And that ultimately led to, a U.S. victory in North Africa. But it's not something that shows up in an easy tally that you can get to a general and say, see, General, we caused this. It's only in hindsight, 30 years after the fact, that they looked at it and went, oh, yeah, this is why they didn't get resupplied.
I give a really, really, really tactical war story real quick. I flew 250 combat missions in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan over the course of a few deployments, a few different types of aircraft, all that stuff. And most of those were in the Strike Eagle. And the Strike Eagle has a gun. The gun is optimized for air-to-air. It's got an upcant in the gun for extra lead and all that stuff. And so when you shoot at the ground, it's a lot harder and it doesn't hit a whole lot of things, right? And so I used to teach our squadron was like, none of this is in the books, right? It's all about you put the thing in the thing. This is the procedure to hit something with this gun. And you're like, okay. And then people go practice it forever. And I remember us, teaching the squadron as the weapons officer was like, it kind of doesn't matter. You guys know that, right? I don't understand. We're supposed to put the thing on the thing and, strafe the fighting position, that kind of thing. It's like, listen, there's 5 ways that you can use this gun in the Strike Eagle, for air to ground. Actually, hitting something is number 5. So you go and we have these scenarios that we would come up with to challenge the people to think differently. Okay. And in one of these, and I've probably used the gun 9 different times, something like that in combat. And one of them, I distinctly remember, back to your story, it's like we had a troops pinned down. It was like Nadi Ali, helmet area, back when it was block to block fighting with the British, and they're pinned down and they're taking fire from all these different directions, and they're going back and forth, yada yada yada, and then finally I could tell the whole scenario, they're getting wrapped around the axle in the scenario, and they're still taking fire. They're yelling on the radio, and finally it's what is the commander's intent? It's the commander's intent is to get the hell out of here. I'm like, okay, so you don't want to go to the objective? No. We want to retrograde. I'm like, cool. I'm just going to lay down fire between the red and the blue forces, and I'm going to tell you when it's going to happen. They're going to stop shooting, and now you can withdraw. Okay. So we just did 3 strafe passes and laid down a string of bullets. So we just a really banana pass. We don't want a big tight grouping. We want to just put down suppressive fire, a line between the red and blue forces. And because the blue forces knew it was coming, they were prepared. The red were so everyone stops. The blue are able to break contact. Commander's intent is met. I didn't have to do anything special with the gun. I just had to put bullets on the ground at the right place, at the right time. So those kinds of things, you getting creative of what is the commander's intent? What is the effect you're trying to achieve? And do effects-based outcomes is what you should be focused on.
Let me piggyback on that. Something I was going to say earlier, but it goes right in line with it, is when you're in an innovative environment, in an innovative company like you are right now, you want people thinking outside the box. You want them to expand their horizons and not get locked into, well, this is the way it's always done. That's why the Air Force and the DOD is where it is right now, is because people have been coloring within the lines forever on so many things. How do you convey trust to your team and convey the right level of trust to your team? You talked about commander's intent. So how do you give them your vision, and how do you trust them with that in a way to where they're I got this, I can run with scissors because Mike said I could. And what does that look like? To where they really get thinking, they really are not constrained by what used to be and the way it's always done.
Well, first of all, I'd say that and you could talk to people who have worked with me, even when I was on active duty, I'm wired a little different, I think. And I have a few things that I'm very passionate about. One of them is that to leave it better than you found it. And so I'm always big on making my replacement better than I ever was. So that transfer of knowledge and then making them the next generation better than me, that's always the one. I was never wanted to keep a secret. I was always big on that. So I'll start with that. And that leads me into different ways, and good, bad, or ugly, but that's kind of where my heart's been. So start with that. If you're not learning, if you're not getting smarter, you're getting dumber. At the end of the day, right? So you need to have a license to learn, to stretch yourself. And that's not just developing the expertise, because that's part of it, but you also have to develop the experience. And experience comes with good, bad, and ugly things, right? And I think you guys could probably appreciate this. You learn a lot more from bad outcomes than you do from good outcomes because it gives you a direction of what not to do, right? So failure is actually a good thing because it gives you clarity of like, okay, let's take that off the list. What else can we do? Right? If everything you try succeeds, I would argue you're not trying hard enough. And so that's the first thing. So like you have a license to learn. I think I put a lot of high trust in what I call two-way decisions. Have you ever heard the two-way versus one-way decisions? So I think about like a door, right? So most of the decisions you have or in life really are two-way decisions. And a lot of times people overcomplicate them. And it's a decision that like, you go through the door, you're like, that was not the right decision. Cool. Turn around, walk back out, right? Those are the decisions that you want to delegate, empower people, like let them learn, right? Now, it's very, very important. You need to know when you have a two-way decision and a one-way decision. And those one-way decisions are the ones that you want to make sure that you have all the evidence so you can make the best informed decision possible. The worst thing in the world you can do as a leader is to treat a two-way decision as a one-way decision, right? So I've got something that's so easy. It's like, just delegate it. Like, one of the worst things as a commander in the military could ever do is to give an order that should never have to be an order, right? Like, dude, you didn't have to even tell us that. Like, and you've probably seen examples of that in your careers where, like, as soon as that happens, everyone instantly knows, like, that shouldn't have happened. The commander should not be doing that. And so big on like delegating those two-way decisions and then coming back and like, it worked. Cool. What'd you learn? If it didn't work, great. What did you learn? And what are you going to do about it? Right? So big high trust in two ways. When you have one ways, I think there's an opportunity to mentor and lead people through decision making, right? Because it's not just about experience and expertise. It's how you have to wire and you train your brain of how you actually make decisions. And all of that collectively ties into your judgment, right? So you get an example in operational planning in the military. Like, how do you take something that is such a wicked problem and get everyone aligned to do something besides just staring at it? Like, hey, you got 12 hours in mission planning. Like, figure it out. We need to get your tasking order out the door to get signed. Like, what do? Like, you look at all the data and then you start labeling it, right? So I'm a big fan of labeling it. It's like, this is facts and assumptions, right? So I've got this piece of information. Is it a fact? Is it an assumption that we have to treat as a fact to unblock us? Or is it a weak assumption? And it's like, great. So now my assumptions become homework and taskers. And if it's an assumption, I go, hey, go validate this assumption. And it's a fact. When was the last time was that a fact? What's the timestamp on that? So as the conditions change, right? So I'm collecting my body of evidence to inform that one-way decision. And so helping people and honestly, just going along for the ride with them, they get the blocked and you're kind of in the right seat. You're like, hey, let me help you out. Here's what I would do. Here's what I think. I'm a big fan of that. I'm also a big fan of transparency. You can ask most people I work with. I don't keep a secret and I'll tell you what I'm thinking. To include like, here's how I arrived at, here is why I think about this way. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. But I'm always trying to share that because at the end of the day, the superpower any one of us has as leaders is to have another one of us helping us, right? If we can somehow have a magic machine to replicate us, we don't, but that's what leadership is, building other leaders.
I love it. Yeah. You're training your replacement. You want somebody, and I love what you said earlier about your goal is for the person after you to be way better than you. And if you start them off where you started off, that makes it harder for them unless they're just inherently more talented than you. But if you set them up for success to where they walk in and things are already running really well, and they have a team that feels trusted and loves the mission, already understands it, then they're just doing minor tweaks to it, or they can take the organization to the next level. But it doesn't happen if that guy comes in or that girl comes in and they're stuck where you started, or if you've made the organization worse than how you started it. Yeah. And so that's a great goal and it's a great aspiration in an organization.
One of the things I thought about a lot, I really didn't think about too much until I retired. And I was in one of my last jobs I had, and we had someone at the company, a leader at the company would occasionally give these talks about special operations leadership. And it's like, okay, I got it. Been around special operations guys a lot of my career, totally understand what you're saying. I had, the meeting after the meeting. One day I was sitting down with our team. I was like, hey guys, like, that none of that works, right? They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, I mean, it works, but just the circumstances are different, right? Like special operations leadership, those are handpicked, hand-selected, vetted people that get put on an all-star team. And then after all that, this person's going to tell you how to lead them. It's like, You know what the real secret of military leadership is? It's conventional leadership. You don't get to pick your team. You don't get to determine when they show up. You don't know who they are. You have to make magic happen with the team and the cards that you have. And that is a special kind of leadership that I think is really underappreciated in life. And so the non-special operations leadership, I think, is so, so critical because those are the life skills that you're going to have outside of the military, right? Or in everything you do in life. Turns out you don't get to control your own destiny. You're living in the world just like everyone else, right? And so those skills of how you can bring together a team, get them to align on something that's a mission, get the buy-in, the belief, and you encourage them and you want to foster and grow that, and they become an actual team and not just a bunch of people that are in a group. But that is something really, really special.
I agree with you. And it's like a fighter squadron. I mean, a fighter squadron may not be as high tier as a lot of soft teams, but it can be. In general, that you graduate and you get a fighter from pilot training or nav training, you get a fighter, you're in the top of your class. And so you're highly motivated, you're type A, and you can have a fighter squadron, like in my case, a fighter squadron of 40 pilots that would literally do anything I asked them to do. And I just had to point them in a direction and get out of their way. That's a very simple leadership problem. You just have to be the one coming up with the vision. And even then, if your vision sucks, a lot of times well, I'm pretty sure we want to go this way. I'm pretty sure the boss wants to go this way. And so that's where we're going to go. And it would probably turn out better because I didn't have to talk and I didn't have to say anything. But the regular managing a McDonald's is how I would say, when you're managing a mix of high schoolers and, high school or, college dropouts and people that aren't sure where they want to go, and then a couple of, strong individuals, that's a tough problem. That's a tough leadership problem. It's much more difficult than leading a bunch of high performers.
Derek and I talked about that a little bit just when he was writing his book, because I said, one of the unfortunate things that we have, because we all have a lot of experience and great stories and everything else, but every single one of us worked with a majority of our force, whether they were handpicked or not handpicked, were pretty motivated and wanted to be better. And then you get out in the civilian world. I started flying the jets after I went out on the Air Force. I started looking around and I realized wow, not everybody really wants to come to work every day and not everybody's trying to make things better. I mean, it was a bit of an eye-opener for me because I'm so used to working with, now I got lucky. I worked with just what you're talking about. My teams that I worked with later in my career were hand-picked. And the guys that I worked with were hand-picked. It wasn't always that way in my career, but I worked with some pretty high velocity folks. And then I get out and start realizing. So I told Derek, I said, that's the challenge for you and for all of us is when we're trying to translate our leadership to other people, we have to recognize that some of our leadership experience was some of the cream of the crop of, American society, and you're not dealing with the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the things I'm not the smartest person in any room that I walk into. Generally, I am the dumbest person of any room I ever walk into, but I generally, you can argue one way or the other, but there's one thing that I don't think anyone would argue with. I care more than anyone else when any room I ever walk into. I care, right? And so I've always treated myself as kind of a missionary, not a mercenary. And so, what you're talking about, Rob, is you run into people that are not saying in a derogatory word, but they're not missionaries, they're not mission driven, they're mercenaries. I get paid, I go do this, then I go home and, I do whatever. Yeah. Being surrounded by nothing but really missionaries and those high performing teams, you get a little pampered because you don't have that challenge of managing a team that's eclectic and has both. Or maybe you have a team that's I've got a bunch of mercenaries, but I have a mission to do. This is going to be a leadership challenge, right?
Yeah, I had a kid I was supervising in a company I was working for a couple of years ago, and he's a project analyst. And I started talking to him about progressing in his career, becoming a project manager and managing large programs. He's like, I don't want to do that. He was content to be where he was. He was a good worker, very competent, but he didn't have the kind of, that was a kind of a shock to my system. What do you mean you don't want to be in charge? What do you mean you don't want to, take on more responsibility? And he was happy, and I was happy to have him working for us, but it was a paradigm shift for me of there are actually people who have a different vision of the world than I do, and I have to learn how to deal with that.
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the things I did to start the year off with our team, again, they're getting to know me, I'm getting to know them, and so I try to overshare just to kind of let's accelerate this process to get to know me. So I have a one-page memo that I wrote the company and it's just titled 2026 Vision. And it's just, here's what I believe Here's what I think to be true. These are the goals. Here are the 3 goals this year. I won't share what they actually are, but here are the 3 goals. And then I bet to make those goals happen, you just have to do these 3 simple things. Do this, and do this. And if you can do those 3 things in that order, we will hit all of our goals. And it's so stupid simple. And so when I talked to the team, I was like, hey, if you find yourself and you're going like, I don't know where I fit in or why I'm doing this, just go look at the memo on the wall. Does it fit into one of those 3 things? And if you say no, then go talk to your supervisor. Go like, I don't think we should be doing this. I'm like, great, you're right. Stop doing that, right? Like, what am I doing? How does it contribute? And why does it matter, right? So you try to create a mission, and you try to create that missionary type environment for people. And I'm not saying that, mercenaries are not, but people that are trying to get aligned, right? Because like being mission focused, and we say things like that as a buzzword, but it really, really is a cultural difference. I remember in a fighter squadron, I was in a fighter squadron. You could work, you're technically limited by 12-hour crew days if you're flying all the time, but you would work 14 hours a day, but you wouldn't be like, man, I'm so tired, I can't wait to go home. You'd get kicked out of the squadron, be like, you're hitting crew S, get out of here. You legally can't be here. And I was in a squadron, we had a really, really strong culture, and every Sunday at 1:00, the vault would be full of people in regular clothes, just studying and preparing. And so Sunday from like 1 to 5, it was like 4 hours or so of just everyone's in there and they're talking about tactics, and they're just there on a Sunday afternoon because like their heart's in it. And they go, hey, I'm going to put this time in because these 4 hours I get so much return on investment to advance the mission and how I'm going to help the mission. Totally worth every minute. Now, I know people are probably listening to that and like, why would you go to work on the weekend if you didn't have to? And those people don't understand.
That's the difference between a missionary and a mercenary. And you got to balance all your responsibilities, but that really is the difference between somebody who totally cares and somebody who is just earning a paycheck. So that I'm not trying to disparage anybody who tries not to work on Sunday, but you know what I mean.
Well, that was one of my biggest changes when I left the military. I realized when I left the military, and I told this to people, I said, look, I'm not looking for a second career. I had a great career. I don't need another one. I'd like a paycheck for a few years. And that's what I told myself. But then as I start going to work and I start realizing that like civilians in the aviation business don't mentor each other. It's crazy. Even the guys that are listed as your instructors and your evaluators stuff, they don't mentor. They're not there to teach and learn and whatever else. It was weird to me. And so very quickly I got, bumped up and I became a fleet lead. So now I'm a guy that's in charge of 45 dudes. And I was like, how did this happen? Like I was supposed to be a mercenary, in your terminology, I'm just supposed to be a mercenary. And next thing I know, I'm this guy. But I found it really hard because you said it's a cultural thing. I could not shut off the fact that I was just trying to make the job, the organization, the thing better for everybody. For the guys working with all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, that's what led me to finally just retire and say, you know what? Yeah, I'm not cut out for this, mercenary stuff. And, the company I worked for didn't want to hear from a pilot because they looked at me as a pilot instead of realizing that like I got a lot of other experience. And so I finally said, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to walk away and, hang out in Florida and do my own thing with my family. And then, Derek calls up and goes, hey man, I got this podcast. They want to help me out, but again, it's culture that runs deep. It's culture that runs deep. And it's very hard, I think, to change somebody across that line without very concerted effort, right? Like taking a mercenary and turning them into a missionary, you got to have a spiritual experience to do that. And if you take a missionary and turn them into a mercenary, boy, those have style.
Well, Mike, I appreciate you being with us today. And I'd love to circle back a year from now to see how you're doing, to see how your vision to your team is working out, how you guys have been able to affect the market, affect the Department of War and the Air Force in particular on how they view drones and how they view production in the industrial base. And hopefully you're able to knock some of the scales off of these long-held beliefs that we have in the Defense Department and make some progress with it. But I appreciate your time on the show. And for those of you who liked what we said or didn't like what we said, reach out on AskDerekNow.com, ask us some questions. We'll share it with the team here, and then we can have a further conversation if it makes sense to us. If you have another episode, something that we said spurs more thought for another episode, just let us know, and we'll do that. If you haven't already subscribed, do so now. And thanks for joining us for Commander's Intent.
So that's it for today's episode of Commander's Intent Podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you listen and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes will be entered in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 private exclusive leadership coaching package with Derek Oaks himself. So head on over to commandersintentpodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Derek's leadership guide and join us on the next episode.